Welcome, everyone. This is Craig from Asset Horizon for Zer0 Books, along with Matt and Will from the podcast. Today, we are very excited to present to you Jason Reed, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine. Earlier this year, Jason appeared on our podcast for an episode concerning the intersection of Spinoza and Marx, where we also talked about the phenomenon of the Great Resignation. In addition, Jason is the author of the books The Micropolitics of Capital and The Politics of Trans-Individuality from 2015. Today, we are here to discuss Jason's new book, which was released in June of this year, and a softcover forthcoming from Haymarket Books, entitled The Production of Subjectivity, Marx and Philosophy. Jason was kind enough to allow us to preview a bit of his upcoming work for today's interview, which will primarily encompass a discussion of Marx's notion of primitive accumulation, a theme picked up in conjunction with figures such as Louis Althusser, Deleuze and Guattari, Antonio Negri, and Etienne Balibar. So, Jason, welcome back to Asset Horizon, and thank you for joining us today on Zer0 Books.
Thanks for having me.
First, could you tell us a bit about this new title of yours? Why is it important to be thinking about Marx and subjectivity today?
A while ago, I sort of latched on to this phrase, the production of subjectivity, which I like because it can be used to think of in two different ways of the genitive, in sense of, on the one hand, you can talk about the different ways that subjectivity is produced by capital, by things like the wage relation, the commodity form, also by ideology. You could also think about the ways in which sort of antagonistic subjectivities are produced by organizing, by opposition to capital. But at the same time, you can also think about the way in which subjectivity is the primary productive force for capital. Now, I say that in the sense that there was a point when I may have been more attached to a kind of post-autonomous understanding of that idea, that there's a new aspect of subjectivity in the sense that people would argue about sort of immaterial labor, or the fact that when we work, we use not just our bodies, but our minds, our social relations. But I'm not so beholden to that anymore. I think that to some extent, labor power was always about subjectivity, and it was always about bodies, minds, etc. And it's always about this sort of a tension between the way in which capital must produce a certain kind of subjectivity in order to make that subjectivity productive for it. But those two sides of the equation never entirely add up. And that is the space where antagonism and politics emerge, in the non-identity between the two different senses of the production of subjectivity, the way capital produces subjectivity and what that subjectivity produces or is capable of doing.
And in conjunction with the notion of subjectivity, today our focus is going to be a bit narrow. We're going to talk about primitive accumulation. And one of the claims that you emphasize in the chapter that we looked at today was the necessity, or at least the practicality, in thinking of Marx's work in terms of comprising multiple intersecting logics. So on the one hand, Capital Volume 1 begins with an analysis of the commodity form. And then at the end of Capital, we get this discussion of primitive accumulation. And then even in something like the Communist Manifesto, as you point out, we see a different side of Marx in his criticism of the bourgeoisie. What effect does reading Marx in the way that you suggest entail politically, theoretically, and so on? And what are some implications that it might have for a continued engagement with Marx's work?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some sense, I feel like the prescriptive statement, we should read Marx for the different tensions and logics, is also kind of a descriptive statement, because Marx has been read for the different tensions and logics. Like if you read Lukács, for example, the famous reification essay, he pretty much says there's no riddle of capitalism that cannot be brought back to the commodity form. And you can see in someone like Lukács the way in which he pretty much uses the opening, and many people have followed him, where the idea is you read Capital through commodification. You think about the notion that capital confronts us as an immense accumulation of commodities, and think about what it means to think commodification being the prevailing logic of capital. But one of the things that interests me in terms of thinking about primitive accumulation is the way in which people like Althusser, in his famous posthumously published essays on elitary materialism, but also and Deleuze and Guattari in some places, seemed like they wanted to, in some sense, suggest that you could, instead of reading from the beginning of Capital, you could read it backwards from accumulation, from the violent origins of capital, to try and understand a different way of making sense of it. To some extent, I think the history of Marxism is a history of picking different themes and focusing on them, and the way in which alienation could be a theme, commodification could be a theme, and so on, class struggle, the mode of production. These are all different concepts which Marx looks differently if you insist on making them the dominant lens. The other point about this is that it is a kind of late Althusser idea, because Althusser spent a lot of his career arguing for this break between the young and the old Marx. But then by the late 70s, the text Marx in his Limits, Althusser said, I forget so much about the historicizing moment of a break. It's more about there are different logics at work in Marx. And then later in the text in the 80s on anti-materialism, which we'll talk more about, he suggests that part of these logics have to do with the difference between the emphasis on necessity and the emphasis on contingency in historical transformation.
Before we move forward, there's a lot that we're dealing with, and I'm not going to assume that every listener has a very strong grasp of Marx. Maybe they do, but could we get a definition of primitive accumulation? What is Marx talking about with this term? And in the text, one of the problematics that we encounter in defining what capitalism is there's a porousness to all of these concepts, which could constitute one of the reasons that we should be thinking in terms of multiple logics. But maybe we can start with primitive accumulation first.
To some extent, and this is here, I think it's important in talking about this to remember the subtitle of Marx's Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. Because primitive accumulation or original accumulation, some people argue that's a better translation. I mean, Marx often refers to it as primitive accumulation, was the way that people, economists like Adam Smith, solved a particular problem. And the particular problem is that we know that capital, in order for it to come into existence, has two requirements. It needs, on the one hand, people with nothing but their labor power to sell, people who have been dispossessed from the land, from the means of production, and have nothing but their pure capacity to work to sell. And on the other hand, it presupposes people who have money, meaning wealth that is not sort of invested in land or stuck in anything that can be moved around. And those two things come together. But how do we arrive there? Now, the answer that classical political economy gave to this problem was it's a moral version. And Marx has a lot of interesting things to say about how this is almost like the sort of just so fairy tale that capitalism tells about itself, right? In the version of sort of the grasshopper and the ant, right? The idea is that way back when, some people started to save their money and they became the first capitalists, and the others expended themselves in, as Marx puts it, riotous living, and they became the first workers. So that's the story that classical political economy tells about its origins. Now, when Marx talks about it, he's offering a critique of that story, and a critique that functions on multiple different levels. On the one hand, he doesn't think that it's possible for individual intentions and moral differences to by themselves make history, right? Because in order to find workers, you need people to be dispossessed from the land. Even if you just had money to spend and everyone had access to the land or to the commons, you wouldn't find anyone to take up your offer. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that Marx, he juxtaposes primitive accumulation with his discussion of what capital is like in the quote unquote colonies, which he means America, and how if people have an alternative to selling their wage labor, they generally take up that alternative, right? That in Europe, when you destroy the commons, when you take over all the land and people have no choice but to sell their labor power in order to survive, it looks like that's a natural occurrence. But as long as people have an alternative, they don't sell their labor power. So Marx thinks that the real history of human accumulation is not a moral history of savers and spenders. It's a bloody history of expropriation, of people being removed from their access to the land, to the conditions of existence and being forced into vagabondage and being dispossessed. And those people, the people who have no other choice to sell their labor power, become the first laborers. And it's also worth pointing out that and Marx has a very dense paragraph where he talks about how you have to think about the history of slavery, about colonization, about all these different factors that converged around the time of beginning in the 1500s onward that made the crucible in which capital came to existence. It's not as simple as some people saved their money and some people spent their money. So that Marx is offering a critique of a story and a different story of the origins of capital, one that not only replaces moral savings with bloody expropriation, but one that also expands the number of factors that come into play to understand the formation of capitalism. So it's not just, I stress that, like, some people read it as like, oh, the capitalists are the bad guys. Well, that's not the entirety of the point. The other point is the capitalists didn't really create their own conditions, right? Marx has this great sentence where he says, like, the knights of industry seized upon the conditions that they themselves had no origins in creating. He talks about the way in which a lot of the push to sort of push people off the land had to do with things like turning to sheep grazing rather than forcing people off the land, had nothing to do with, no one was thinking, aha, we'll make these people into workers. That really became almost a byproduct of other historical processes, that suddenly you had a population with nothing but their labor power to sell.
Firstly, hi Jason, good to have you back on.
Hello.
Enjoyed reading through the papers as always. I think there were three sort of topics I wanted to touch on at some point or another in our interview. One of them I'm going to leave just for a moment because I think will enjoy talking about that as well. But I wanted to start with the question of contingency in the way that you're reading Marx, because of course there's so many different sort of interpretations of Marx, of Capital and his other texts, and one of them has been this what's sort of called a stagist, I suppose, a sort of a understanding of history in which there are sort of distinct, definable stages of history. There's capitalism, and then before that there's feudalism, and before that there's various other forms and so on. But one of the things that you emphasize and that you find, I think, in Althusser in particular, is that firstly that there's this understanding of a social totality that isn't reducible to what Marx calls the mode of production, but also where in a given social structure, or the exact term being used was social formation, multiple modes of production can coexist in various degrees and areas. You might have a society in which certain relations, which might have emerged under feudalism, sort of maintain and persist, even under a broadly capitalist system. And Althusser seems to be where a lot of this idea of contingency comes into it, which is that the birth of capitalism in this, maybe via this process of primitive accumulation, almost didn't have to happen, right? Or it might have been likely, or more likely, or less likely at certain stages, and under certain conditions. But it's only when you meet these two flows meet, I think as Deleuze and Guattari call it, right? As you in the essay of essentially unlanded and dispossessed workers willing to sell their labor for a wage, and on the other hand, those with capital and money, both willing and sort of intent on investing that money for valorization and returns, etc. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the way that Althusser thinks about necessity and contingency when he's reading Marx and trying to provide a Marxist analysis of the origins of capital, of capitalism, how it works today. What's Althusser on about when he's trying to emphasize contingency, which other Marxists might not, perhaps? And what is it that marks him out there? What is it that you find useful in that approach that leads you to read him rather than someone else?
Yeah, I mean, Althusser has this line, that he says, rather than think of contingency sort of as an exception to necessity, we have to think necessity as nothing other than the becoming necessary of contingent encounters, right? The idea of a sort of primacy of contingency. And the essay, and I call it that loosely because this was a posthumously published, and sort of stitched together piece that Althusser was working on in the 80s. And it's this very strange text. He goes through a reading he talks about Rousseau, he talks about Machiavelli, he talks about Epicurus and so on. And he talks about this idea that all these philosophers have this thing in common, that they understand the primacy of contingency over necessity, the primacy of what he calls the encounter. And the encounter is sort of two things sort of coming together. And from that encounter, it sort of alters their relations, alters their states. But that encounter, I think, this is what I think Althusser means when he says the becoming necessary of contingency. The contingent element never entirely dissipates. It never entirely goes away. And I think to think that in terms of Marx, and I do think that my reading of Althusser's essay is that the long meditation on contingency is there to kind of set up this reading of Marx. And I think one of the things he wants to stress against sort of stagist readings of Marx and so on is this idea that at any moment, the fundamental relation that defines capital, people have nothing to sell their labor power, selling their labor power to capitalists, and capitalists using that labor power to exploit it and create surplus value. That thing, that relation is, even though there's a lot to make it necessary, right? It's necessary because most of us don't have access to the means of production otherwise. We don't have a way to grow enough food to live off of or produce enough to live off of. There's a lot to reinforce that. And on top of that, there's a whole legal structure, the state, there's ideological ideas about the importance of work and so on. All these things are built on top of that relation to make it as necessary as it possibly could, but all those things don't make it necessary. It can come apart at any moment, right? It can come apart in the sense that if tomorrow no one showed up to work, that would be the end of the entire capitalist relation. So the necessary is always haunted by the contingency that it's desperately trying to efface. And I think that one of the things I think that Althusser is trying to do in that essay by placing together all these different philosophers, Machiavelli, Rousseau, etc., they all think of the becoming necessary in different ways. Like in Machiavelli's case, the prince, he talks a lot about the prince being very dependent upon fortune, like seizing the right moment. But what a prince does once they come into power is make it appear as if it wasn't the right moment. They were the right prince, right? They were the right person. They had the virtue, they had the capacity. So that's how this works in the political structures. Marx talks about how it works economically. All these layers are really about the same basic fundamental problem, that all social relations founded upon contingency, the first thing they do is try to exercise the ghost of that contingency. Because the more that contingency is seen, the more, we talked about this last time I was with you guys about the Great Resignation, about people not showing up to work. The more the contingency is seen, the more the social relation could possibly come apart or be made into a different way.
Yeah, I was going to say, because, I mean, the whole question of like ideology critique is a really vexed one, I think, is what Marx experience one these days, and we've talked about it before, but there's almost a sort of ideology critique element to that, right? But in terms of exposing the sort of the contingency, like the non-necessity of the way that things actually are, and yeah, the sort of repression of those contingencies which it relies upon but can't actually, it has to disavow as well. No, you have no choice. This really is all there is. One thing I wanted to pick up on, there was something you said a moment ago, was that in thinking through the encounter, where the effects never really disappear, they're carried on through. The obvious one being this conversation, when labour power and capital meet, that produces a whole series of effects, but which carry on through down further chains, right? I was thinking back to, and it's been a few years since I read this in Venice, but I think it was in Silvia Federici's work, where she talks about primitive accumulation a lot. And my understanding is that one of her claims is that if we think of primitive accumulation as this thing that took place in the past and therefore produced capitalism, we've made a very serious, primitive accumulation isn't just a one-off sort of event, whether it takes a second or a month or whatever. It's actually an ongoing process inherent to capitalism's capacity to be able to sustain itself, that this process has to be understood as an ongoing one into which we can intervene. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that sort of approach based on this essay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because I do think there is a difference between the way in which Althusser, for example, is thinking about primitive accumulation and the contingency that always haunts capitalism, and the way that someone like Federici talks about primitive accumulation. Because the way that I think there is a kind of revival of primitive accumulation, which is less about the relationship between contingency and necessity and more about the way in which, if the first primitive accumulation was about the destruction of the commons, the sort of commons that people were able to use to gather firewood, collect, hunt, etc., as a condition for survival, that capital continues to accumulate wherever there is a new commons. And people make the argument that what we're seeing now is the way in which we have created through sort of the internet, created a sort of commons of shared knowledge and data, and that partly what is happening with certain types of companies, this is what David Harvey says when he says accumulation by dispossession, is they are constantly trying to turn that commonly created space into something that can be commodified and to change people's relation to it to a wage relation. So that's a different understanding, I think, of the ongoing nature of primitive accumulation. I think that for Althusser, he really just means that the very things that hold the economic social structure together are never really as tethered together as they appear to be, and that at any moment they could unwind. He's less interested in making an argument about the ongoing nature. I mean, there's a long history, I mean, going back to Rosa Luxemburg, of people arguing whether or not primitive accumulation is a moment in the formation of capitalism, or is it an ongoing process? And then people have different ideas about what it's ongoing in relation to. For someone like Luxemburg, it was the way in which capital always needed an outside of pre-capitalist social spaces to colonize and transform, more sort of external to the capitalist societies, where someone like Federici and George Cofensis will talk about it in terms of not colonies over there, but internal spaces, wherever there's a space where commonly shared resources, knowledge, or information are primary, those will be turned into new forms of primitive accumulation. Sort of like the way in which I always remember that, like back before there was Airbnb, there was a couch surfing software that went sort of kind of big. People were like using it all the time, and it was basically used the same sort of principle, right? Because people would want to couch surf only if they knew something about the house they were crashing in. No one wants to go into a complete utter, but because the internet made it possible for other people to say, yeah, I crashed at the guy's place, totally fine, he's totally chill, so on. It used that to kind of create it in a non-monetary way, and to some extent Airbnb sort of privatized that relation and turned it into, so it used the commons of sort of social reputation as a basis for a new privatization. So that's sort of closer to what Federici thinks, and I think that there has been some pushback around that. Will Roberts, in his book Marx's Inferno, he's kind of argued that maybe people have paid a little too much attention to primitive accumulation, because for him, what's really interesting about Marx's critique of capitalism is the way in which capital doesn't need this external relationship to the state or force or violence to be a force and violence in social life. All it needs is to be capital. And it has its own sort of internal structural, because Marx has these lines in Primitive Accumulation where he talks about how like the bloody sort of excess sort of dissipates into the day-to-day of economic relations, right? And that there's a certain sense in which there's a for and against the ongoing nature of primitive accumulation. And I think the argument against says that we need to really pay attention to the idea that capital doesn't need the drama of primitive accumulation. Once it sets up, it just needs to keep on being capital.
I have a question about that notion of pre-justification, and it's, well, a question about whether it is like unique to this specific moment. But beyond that, one question that I have is about the relationship between this question of morality as it exists in certain political economists or a certain political economic tradition that Marx is responding to. But one question that I have is, even if this moralization is, let's say, not representative of the material circumscription of the commons, the accumulation of bodies, it seems to me that like the moral explanation still plays a fundamental material role in forcing the coercion and creating that validity clause of the working class that needs to be constantly regenerated and moralized, right? The member of the working class at this period in history undergoes a fundamental moral change where one's relationship to one's own body, its social functioning, the family has to be subject to an entire array of vast power relations. So I'm wondering, while on the one hand, the moral explanation remains insufficient for this history, doesn't it still fundamentally have a material or discursive role to play when we talk about these perfectly calculated strategies of power, especially when we're trying to prevent labor dissipation, one's own relationship to their body, to their own capacities, and so on. What under neoliberalism would probably be called human capital, which, of course, I don't mean to say those two things are the same. They're totally different, but they seem to echo one another. So I'm wondering, doesn't morality still have a kind of material function in this history?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that this is one of the things I think is really interesting about, and this came already, thinking about Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation as a particular form of ideology critique, and the way in which, I mean, first of all, one of the things I think is very interesting about the story of primitive accumulation is it's a strange temporal dislocation, right? It uses an idealized version of the present, right? I could become a capitalist if I save enough money and use that money and buy a food truck and have some people work for me or whatever. I could become a capitalist if I save rather than spend. I could switch from the worker side of the equation to the capitalist side of the equation. And to some extent, I say that's an idealized version of the present because so often that's the carrot, but very few people get to actually do that because bills come up and so on and so forth. And your car breaks down and there goes your savings for that. So you find yourself constantly on the worker side of the equation. But it's an idealized version of the present that's transposed onto the past, right? This is how capitalism came into existence. Some people were saved. That's where it gets its moral veneer kind of from the past. But then it's operative in the present, or I would say maybe to kind of twist the temporal dislocation, operative in the future. Because one of the things I think is interesting is that, and this going beyond Marx's text, if you look at a lot of the studies which are coming out about work, especially in the late 20th and early 21st century, as working conditions degrade and collective bargaining is not a reality for a lot of people, is that the moral dimension of work begins to take on more and more importance as its material rewards dissipate, right? People begin to, there's more and more of this notion that working itself is considered to be morally worthwhile, a proof of your worth as a human being, a proof of the effort you're taking, even as that work doesn't pay your bills or make your living conditions possible. So the moral dimension sort of lingers long after, or lingers as a kind of a supplement to the material conditions, and almost reinforces the material conditions. So it almost becomes, we work to prove our moral standing rather than we work to simply make money. Here, I'm tempted to say that this is something that I think Hegel understood as well in his own weird way. In the philosophy of right, when Hegel says the fundamental problem of a capitalist society is that it creates unemployment, it creates surplus populations, and it can't give those people work, because if it gives those people work, it'll put other people out of business and mess with the fundamental rules of private property, which have already been established. But at the same time, it can't give those people money without work, even though there's enough money to go around in society, because in doing so, those people won't have the moral standing necessary to be members of society. They won't be. I mean, this is, in some sense, I think, like Hegel's, like his own reactionary nature is useful here, because he's pretty much posed the dilemma which, for much of the 20th century, a lot of nations were struggling with. You can't give people work, you can't give people money, because of the fact that work always has both a moral sense and an economic sense to it. It's always both how we produce and reproduce the conditions of our existence, but it's also how we produce and reproduce our sense of worth and belonging. And you can't have one without the other, and so you can't entirely separate them from each other. So if you give people money without work, you in some sense give them material conditions without giving them moral conditions. And if you give people work not based on its own economic necessity, you'll give people moral conditions, but you'll disrupt the economic structures of a free market society. So we're always stuck between them. I mean, in Hegel's view, Hegel also, this is where primitive accumulation comes up in Hegel, he's like, luckily we have colonies, and we can send people over there, we can send excess stuff over there. So a different version of primitive accumulation and the ongoing nature of primitive accumulation and the need to constantly find a new colony with every border, or find a new entrepreneurial niche with every technological displacement of employment, right? In the sense that we're constantly forced to primitive accumulate on ourselves.
Both Akil Membe and Michel Foucault speak of this function of the penal colony as that which can sort of start to, I guess, deal with these very much intended products of this form of relation. But then, and I'm pretty allergic to contemporary commentary, at the same time, we get a story of this politico-ethical issue at the state level in the United States, where all of these different state houses are absolutely stuck trying to figure out how to remoralize work after COVID, for example. And we're seeing the rise of companies dedicated to synergistic workplaces being paid to tell companies that actually owning landed capital is good because workers on campus is really important. Like the stockade that you send yourself to in the morning at 8 a.m. is like really fundamental to your own productivity and sociality. So I think that this question of the ethico-political remains really important.
Yeah, if I could just jump off that real quick. So yeah, and I think that, because we were talking about production of subjectivity at the beginning, it is in the section of primitive accumulation that Marx has the line that talks most about subjectivity, where he says the capitalist mode of production needs a working class which treats its requirements as self-evident natural laws, right? The idea that you need to not only have a population with nothing but their labor power to sell, but you need a population with nothing but labor power to sell who understands the idea of selling their labor not as a historically contingent and possible economic relation, but as the only possible economic relation. And you do that, I think, through a moralizing around the nature of work as a necessary condition of subjectivity. And I also think, to kind of go a little bit into being a little bit loose with the term, I mean, I think about the way in which, since one version of primitive accumulation is this idea that you must go through a process of violence and force and expropriation to get to a normal economic relation. Sometimes I think about the way in which certain narratives of the hustle are themselves a kind of primitive accumulation of subjectivity, right? You see these things pop up, like if you haven't done these things by age 30, if you're coming home at the end of your day of work and saying, I'm done, and not thinking about What your side gig is the sense that you have to treat yourself with the same violence and force that the early capitalist state had to treat the expropriated and see them as raw material for future wealth. You have to treat yourself that way. You have to kind of do a great deal of violence onto yourself, forcing yourself to work, to get up, to keep moving, to keep looking for new angles. And the way that becomes its own kind of moralizing logic of, if you haven't done this, if you haven't endlessly endeavored to figure out what qualities you possess that could be exploited, what skills you possess that could be turned into possible jobs or side gigs, then you are in some sense the one to blame for any future economic misfortune you might have. So this sense of almost a kind of internalization of the violence of primitive accumulation, not as the violence done to an expropriated population, but the violence done to your own expropriated free time.
Yeah, and that's why maybe like we're in a moment where like a genealogical undertaking of the production of subjectivity that recognizes life as that which has kind of latent labor power to the thwarted human capital of the person who doesn't start a private baking operation in their home in the midst of the pandemic may actually be worth undertaking. And it probably requires a serious understanding of this split, not just within Marx, but like within Marxist political philosophy.
You mean the split between those who, because I've often talked about there's a split between a kind of Marxist philosophy which understands labor power as a natural attribute of human beings, right? It's what sets us apart from the beaver and the bee. We do labor, and versus the understanding which argues that no, human beings have to be made into workers, and that's a bloody, forceful process. That the idea that we possess labor power has to be driven in by force because it is not at all given by nature.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. I think and I think later in your first chapter, that's kind of what you touch on. So coming attractions for people who can get access to Brill.
So, Jason, I have a question. Actually, there's a few terms that I want to bring into the discussion. I'm hoping at some point in your response to my question, you could talk about the notion of imminent causality, something that we discussed in our Spinoza episode. But I actually kind of want to jump the gun a bit since we're on the topic of subjectivity. Amidst all of the multiple logics that we've identified, the logic of the commodity, for example, the logic of so-called primitive accumulation, since your book is called The Production of Subjectivity, do you think in any sense the notion of subjectivity holds a sort of privileged position in getting any kind of leverage on transforming the capitalist system into something else, exiting the capitalist assemblage? Because we did talk about the refusal of work. Given what you said about imminent causality, where does subjectivity stand against those other multiple logics, and especially with respect to praxis?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real tricks is, and this goes back to what I was saying with the two different readings of Marx. I think one of the challenges is because those two different readings of labor power are also two different readings of subjectivity, right? Do we take subjectivity as a kind of starting point and then talk about the way that subjectivity is alienated or exploited? Or do we see the subjectivity of the worker as itself an historical product, and that people are produced into workers? So that it's whether we see subjectivity as productive or produced. And partly for me, the challenge is not an either or there, but trying to see both sides of that, recognizing that we, to some extent, are produced as workers, and that we have in us through various forms of ideological, affective, legal, etc. We have, in some sense, an attachment to this connection, I think, of work and our self-worth that is not, in some sense, chosen. It is because we are the products of the society we exist within. But that way that we are produced we can resist it, we can transform it, we can try to produce ourselves otherwise, but also that very productivity can have different dimensions or different ways of playing itself out. Like, I mean, I think that going back to imminent causality, as you point out, that so imminent causality, which Althusser took from Spinoza, this notion that God is the transitive cause of all things, that God is nature. And to some extent, Althusser wanted to use that to think about capital. The capital is the imminent cause. In other words, really, what that means is that everything which would appear to be an effect of capital has to also be understood as a cause, right? Ideologies, say ideologies of work, are not just effects of a capitalist society, which is predicated on the exploitation of work, so work is central. They are also causes, because without those ideologies, without those senses of I need to go to work or I'm not a good person, the whole system wouldn't reproduce itself. So the effect is also a cause. And that to some extent means that subjectivity is both an effect and a cause. We are produced by the system and we reproduce this system. And to some extent, that always becomes the basis for some kind of transformation. I mean, it's hard because I think many people are much more comfortable with the idea of, if you think of subjectivity as entirely itself a cause, as being just who we are, the way we come into the world, it's much easier to think about agency in politics because of what we want to do. And to think of ourselves as produced seems to run into a kind of functionalism or something where we're just cogs in a great machine. But I think that the real challenge is to think of ourselves as both produced and productive. And because we are produced and productive, we are an immanent, not just an effect, that to some extent we act on and transform and can transform the very system that produces us.
Yeah, I think where the rubber really meets the road on this question is something that was addressed in the video that was most recently released for Zer0 Books with Tom Wyman and the German ideology, which is, if we're to be class conscious revolutionaries, the challenge is, do we valorize the working class, or do we find a way to abolish the working class so that we can become something else? On the one hand, we have folks on the left who are arguing for the retention or the capture of certain conservative positions or appeals to conservative populations by going on popular radio shows and so forth. And it seems to me that there's a danger in doing this sort of thing, because it seems to be a path to the recuperation of the kind of subjectivity that brings us back into the capitalist fold. What would be required of a subjectivity for us to create a rupture or an exit from the system?
I do think that, to me, the phrase that really captures that is Kathy Weeks' line in The Problem with Work, where she says that we have to both resist, I can't remember her exact terms, but both resist the overvaluation of work, an overvaluation on a moral scale, on being the necessary condition of self-worth, but also resist its devalorization on the economic scale, its continued reduction to less and less of share of what it produces, and continual marginalization in respect to capital. So that it's the sense in which we have to simultaneously be, I think, for workers and against work. It's a very difficult balancing act to pull off. And I do think the temptation on one side is very great, is to fall into a kind of workerism, not workerism in the Italian sense, but workerism in the sense of making the worker kind of a celebrated figure and saying, as people have, like, we're the ones who produce the real wealth, that work is the worker against the capitalist. And so to be both against work and for the worker is a difficult thing to do, although I think it's made a little easier by the fact that we are living in a situation where it's impossible to talk about current struggles around work without talking about not just increased pay, but also increased control over one's time in terms of scheduling, in terms of how much one works. So it's hard to talk about real working conditions is in some sense already to be anti-work, or at least to be always carving out a space for life outside of what work demands of it.
This is a sort of quite a theoretical question, but it's a theory book and it's a theory podcast. I think that's okay. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, the idea of imminent causality, because I think this is probably an area of shared interest for both me and you, is that period in French Marxism and French communism, probably, I think it'd be fair to say, probably led by Althusser and his students and readers, which was the return to Spinoza. Look, I'll be honest, every time I've tried to characterize this split, I've always been taken to task. It's not quite right. It seems to me that they have a number of reservations about the presence of Hegel's system of thought, which remains in Marx, particularly a certain sense of telos or inevitability to things, which would also explain the interest in contingency. So what it seems to me happens in that period in sort of the 60s, I guess, and onwards, is by reading Spinoza again, as Althusser and students do, they're trying to find an alternative sort of set of mechanisms or concepts that can do the same work or even more work, but avoid some of the pitfalls. And imminent causality is clearly one of the central ones. So I suppose I was hoping, actually, because we sort of maybe passed over a little bit there earlier, could you maybe give listeners like a sense of, firstly, what imminent causality is, and why it might actually be relevant for thinking about Marx's work today? Because he does talk about Spinoza here and there. It seems like he sort of presumes that Hegel had sort of finished him off already. So you could just sort of give us a sense of what imminent causality does.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes it useful is that obviously when Spinoza didn't know Hegel existed yet when he wrote about it, but when Althusser brings it up, he talks about, in Reading Capital, he talks about there are sort of three different figures of causality. The sort of standard transitive one, A hits B hits C. But then he also mentions Hegel and the idea of what he calls expressive causality, right? The idea that, and this is kind of a reading of Hegel's, more something like the phenomenology of spirit, where at every given moment in time, there's like a central contradiction that define, like the entire culture can be boiled down to that contradiction, right? Sense that like when Hegel reads Antigone and he says it's all about the status of the individual, in the Greek society couldn't yet torn between individual freedom and sort of an organic sort of belonging to tradition, and it couldn't yet solve the problem of how to reconcile those two. So everything about Greek culture, he reads Plato's Republic this way, he reads Antigone this way. It was all about what to do with the individual and society, right? And had one central contradiction. And I think that to some extent, there are Marxists who think that way. I mean, that like everything's about commodification, everything's about exploit. They find one central contradiction in Marx and read the entirety of the social structure or from that contradiction. And I think that imminent causality, in some sense, means that there's not, in some sense, it means what I was just talking about, that every effect is also a cause, that things that are produced by the capitalist social relation that seem far from it, like ideology in some sense, are also causal conditions, right? This is what Althusser did with reproduction, and basically said, look, without workers showing up to work, the whole system comes to a grinding halt, right? The thing that is the effect of capitalism is actually its cause, right? Workers thinking they need to come back to work every day. So that in part, imminent causality is about seeing effects as causes, but I think it's also about, and this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about multiple logics in capitalism. It's about understanding that capitalism is not one contradiction. It's not just commodification. Although commodification can explain a lot, it's not just exploitation. Exploitation can explain a lot. And it's not just primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation can explain a lot. It's about thinking the way in which these different things cohere in a different totality. And then, not to be too Althusserian about this, but I do think, as Etienne Balibar and others said, the two big concepts that Althusser sort of worked on in the 60s, imminent causality and the conjuncture, right? The one being about the way that all the different levels of structure hold together, and the other conjuncture being about the singular moment, what's happening at this moment, are not two opposed concepts. They're two different ways of looking at the same thing, right? That the imminent cause exists only in and through specific conjunctures, and the specific conjuncture is the imminent cause. So, like, at this moment, we could say, going back to all the things we've been talking about, we are living through a particular articulation of some of the fundamental aspects of primitive accumulation. And you could say that maybe we're living through a moment where there's an increasing tendency to turn social spaces and social relations outside of capital into productive for capital, as we were talking about a few minutes ago. We're also living through a particular moment of exploitation, maybe a hyper exploitation that coincides with that, a particular moment of commodification, that all the different elements of Marx's thought cohere together in a very specific way that defines this particular moment, that would be very different in, say, if we're talking about Marx in the period of sort of high colonialism. We might want to read primitive accumulation very differently, talking not about the primitive accumulation of ourselves into our social spaces, but about what happens when other cultures are forced into monocultures agriculturally and losing their own sort of ways, relations of sustenance and so on, and forced into commodification. That all these things, they'd all be there, primitive accumulation, exploitation, commodification, but they'd be there in very different ways at very different moments. And that goes back to contingency in necessity, right? That's what it means to think contingency and necessity, is to recognize that the way things cohere now is very different from the way things held together, say, in high Fordism or in the early sort of colonialism or whatever case may be. And we have to understand the different articulations of the different causes becoming effects in the specific conjuncture, and that our primitive accumulation is not the primitive accumulation that Rosa Luxemburg talked about. And it's maybe not even the one that Althusser talked about in the 80s. It's different in a different sense.
How much of this can we glean from Marx's dissertation? And of course, like, part of the issue there then is that, like, the war that he's establishing is sort of a play he's putting on for Bruno Bauer, right, in the end. So this question of, like, a dialectical Epicureanism kind of is put in question by the philosophy of the encounter, and especially the appendices of that book, right, which seem to be extremely influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, who I would imagine Althusser initially was probably not too sympathetic to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, in this whole discussion, I mean, if you look back at Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari cite Reading Capital when they talk about the two flows, as they call them, workers and capitalists coming together. They cite Reading Capital on that point. Now, I don't know. I mean, I know that Althusser and Deleuze were kind of in correspondence early on when Deleuze wrote a structuralism piece. But given what Deleuze and Guattari say later and started in 1,000 Plateaus, where they really turn back to primitive accumulation and discuss it further and discuss the strange paradox of it's about a violence that creates legitimacy at the same moment of violence. I don't know if Althusser has read that when he starts working on his aleatory materialism sort of piece, but there does seem to be a way in which Deleuze sort of intensified the contingency in already at work in Reading Capital. And I think, I mean, this goes back to the dissertation point. I mean, I'm too anti-teleological to say that all this was contained in Marx's dissertation. I would say the sort of more almost Althusserian point, like, it's after we read Primitive Accumulation that we can see the role of contingency in the very young Marx, that to some extent the future rewrites the past in the same way that I think that Althusser's later interest in not the epistemological break of Marx, but the tension of the different logics of Marx transform how we can both read Marx and read Althusser. That And I mean, because this has been the eternal debate around Althusser's sort of editorial materialism. Some people have said, I mean, some of Althusser's contemporaries were like, what is this? This is bad metaphysics. I thought we don't do this. We're good materialists here. Others have said, look at what Althusser was saying about the conjuncture. Hasn't he been saying editorial materialism all along? Now that he's finally said it, we can see it. And to some extent, the event is always disclosing the structure in the same way the structure is always producing new events, right? That the production of the text transforms what came before and is creating a new sort of new conditions of readability of both Marx and Althusser on that point.
So you sent us over 2 essays, and I guess we've kind of discussed both, but in sort of a mixed way. But one of the 3 big thinkers, and I think Will knew I was going to ask this at some point, the 3 big thinkers that you talk about, obviously Marx goes about saying, and obviously we've been talking about Althusser so far. And I was wondering how you think Negri fits into this picture, because he's the third thinker you reference quite a lot in both pieces, and in one of the essays which we talked a little bit less about, you entertain the idea that it may be possible that there could be, let's say, some reconciliation between their 2 ways of thinking. So I wanted to ask about Negri's role here in primitive accumulation, because what I wanted to do was to bring this back to something you mentioned maybe just a few minutes ago. You mentioned this idea of sort of pro-worker but anti-work as probably an important political position to take, but also a difficult one, particularly knowing what direction that ought to take. So put it like this. On the one hand, I think in a similar strain of thought, the French communist philosopher and sociologist Frédéric Laudon, one of his ideas or policies that he thinks ought to be pushed for is what he calls it the salary for life. But I guess most people would understand that as being something like a universal basic income. And part of the reason is that on his argument is that's a way of breaking the link between the conditions of survival and the work process itself, basically. That's what Laudon says. And Negri seems at points to suggest that might be one way forward as well. But he's also much more interested in the way in which the commons is continually involved in the process of primitive accumulation, but also what possibilities are there, even if we're not necessarily making use of it yet already. So that's a very broad question, but I suppose I'd sort of like to ask you just, firstly, how does Negri fit into this picture with Althusser and sort of contingency and primitive accumulation? And also, if you have any final thoughts on what that political struggle that you talked about earlier might look like in more concrete terms. One example being perhaps the one I mentioned by Laudon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Negri also makes primitive accumulation central to his rereading of Marx in the book that's known in English as Insurgencies and Constituent Power elsewhere. And for him, it's really about, as you said, the relation between the capitalist relation of sort of primitive accumulation is one of violence and expropriation that has its flip side, the sort of constitutive power of the workers to create sort of commons, and that one has to always see the way in which capital is constantly a process of violent expropriation of the commons. And I think it ties into Negri's argument ultimately that as capital progresses, the role of the capitalist, because Marx is kind of ambiguous about this. Sometimes he talks about how, like an industrial process, you need to have a boss to sort of organize it, and then there's a very kind of progressivist sort of stagist reading of that you've got to pass the moment of the capitalist boss and so on. But I think Negri's point around that is to constantly insist that, at least in contemporary capitalism, that the capitalist is just a relation of violent expropriation from collective actions that it doesn't really constitute anymore. That primitive accumulation shows us that capital is, at the end of the day, nothing other than the violent process of appropriation of that which it doesn't really create and doesn't really control. And what it doesn't create and doesn't control is workers' self-organization. And I think that too, I think that Negri has a very different understanding of what immanence means for Negri, what is imminent to the capitalist system, whereas Althusser says that capital is imminent to social relations. And I think Laudon is on similar lines when Laudon says we live in a capitalist society, not just a capitalist economy, this sort of imminence into everything. But I think that Negri would suggest that what is imminent to capital is labor. That to some extent, the real kind of, that I think Negri really would almost say, not Deus natura, not God that is nature, but capital sive labora, right? That capital is labor. The capital exists only because of labor. And to some extent, it's a paper tiger. It's a hollow thing placed upon these relations of labor. And the more, this is why Negri at one point says that when he talks about Spinoza, he has this line where he says that it's Spinoza's critique of representation, political representation, that is more useful for Marxists than Marx's critique of exploitation. And what is that in Negri's view? That is Negri's reading of the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, is that human beings create an image of the divine to rule over other human beings, and what we efface in that creation is the role of our own productivity. So to some extent, where Althusser thinks that systems like capital exist by effacing their contingency, Negri thinks they exist by effacing the constitutive power of subjectivity that is truly at their base. Not just their contingency, but the fact that we, as workers, we make this system. That is what is imminent. I do think Insurgencies, as it's known in the US, is a very important book. And I do think that some of the stuff Negri's done since then he's hurt his own reputation, but that's a whole other matter.
Jason, I just want to say thanks again. You're a great friend of our podcast. People appreciate your work. We're going to pick up your book and take a deeper dive into it. But as we understand it, you have another book coming out on Verso sometime this year, correct?
Next year, 2023, fall 2023.
And tell us about that book a little bit.
The title I would like to have, and that hasn't been finalized, is The Double Shift, Spinoza and Marx and the Politics and Ideology of Work. It is both my attempt to write my critical take on work, but it's also my attempt to put together, drawing from Laudon, from Tossel, from Althusser, what the Spinoza-Marx relation looks like for me, and why it's necessary and useful for thinking about the production of subjectivity today. So I'm trying to say this quasi-cryptically to make it look like, to create this sort of coming attractions feel, but I'm not sure if I'm doing a good job right now. But I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point when it comes out, and more will be clear then.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.